This is Cato Weekly Video. President Bush is fast approaching his final year in office, but what will be his legacy? Author Glenn Greenwald attempts to give the answer in his book, A Tragic Legacy: How a Good versus Evil Mentality Destroyed the Bush Presidency. He spoke at the Cato Institute August 7, 2007.
If you ask most people in the political press, the people who go on television and write articles that most people read, if you ask them, well, what is George Bush's political philosophy? They'll tell you, well, he's a conservative. He's a conservative Republican. And I doubt I need to, given where we are, list all of the unconservative acts that the president has undertaken, from the wild spending increases, not just in terms of national security, but domestic as well, that Tim alluded to in his introductory remarks, as well as the complete evisceration of any principles of federalism. There's a whole slew of areas that have long been preserved to the states in order to regulate, from marriage to the use of medicine and medical marijuana to the Terry Schiavo case where Florida state law was being faithfully applied by a Florida state judge, and the federal government intervened to Oregon's assisted suicide policy, where the Bush administration has asserted the power of the federal government to federalize all of those areas, a principle or a behavior that could not be more antithetical to what conservatism claimed to stand for. And of course, the most significant one is the vast expansions of government power, of the belief that the U.S. government can engage in virtually unlimited surveillance of United States citizens in terms of what we do and how we communicate and with whom we communicate, even on our own soil. The ability to detain people, as Tim alluded to, without due process of any kind. The ability to operate in complete secrecy with virtually no oversight and no checks. These are principles that could not be more antithetical to, at least in theory, what conservatism claimed to espouse. And that leads to the question then, well, if conservatism, as traditionally understood, at least in theory, is not the guiding principle that has been animating the Bush administration, what is the guiding principle? Is it all just random, and is it just scattered, or is there a consistent worldview that has fueled all of this behavior? And what I did for the book was I went back and I read as many interviews with the president, as many speeches he and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and the rest of his supporters have given, and looked at the justification for these actions. And what you see when you go and do that is that there's really one theme that predominates virtually our entire public discourse. And that is the theme that we, the United States, and our leaders believe in what is good in the pure and objective sense. And there are people and entities out in the world who are evil, pure evil, and they are our enemies. And the challenge of the government, the federal government, which embodies the good, and our political leaders who crusade for the good, is to gather as much power as possible in order to defeat and crush and annihilate the evil, the enemy. Because enemies and evil, by their nature, as this theory goes, cannot be accommodated or negotiated with or compromised with or achieve a coexistence with, because they're evil. And those who are evil want to destroy us. That's what their defining attribute is. And clearly this was the framework, the dualistic framework that was applied over and over and over again from the day of 9/11 up until today. And it resonated with Americans when it got applied to 9/11, because it's not very difficult to view the act of hijacking planes with civilians and flying them into office buildings in order to slaughter as many people as possible. It's not difficult to see that as an act of evil. And so that rhetoric resonated. But what happened was that template, that belief that everything can be divisible into pure good and pure evil, and that all we need to know is we need to destroy evil, began to be applied to every single political conflict and every single issue that we began to discuss, both foreign and domestic. And as the issues arose that were far more complex than simply identifying a villain, as we invaded Iraq and deposed the villain Saddam Hussein, and then we're faced with an incredibly complex set of conflicts between all sorts of morally ambiguous actors, that good versus evil mentality left us completely lost. And if you look at the debate, the so-called debate that we had as a country prior to invading Iraq, what you see is that there was no debate, because the good versus evil mentality meant that you either supported the destruction of evil, or you yourself were indifferent to evil, or even worse, an aider and abetter of evil. And there really was no attempt to engage those people who turned out to be right, who were making rational arguments about all of the difficulties that would ensue and all of the dangers that we would unleash if we invaded that country. You can go back and look at the debate that took place. Those people were stigmatized and ignored because they could be, because they were on the side of evil or were indifferent to it and therefore ought not to be listened to. And this is really the animating justification for every policy that has occurred virtually over the last 6 years, and it is the predominant theme that dictates the discussions and the debates that we have in our public discourse. One of the interesting aspects of that is that, and I did a podcast interview here for the Cato site right before we began, and I get this question all the time, which is, well, what about Ronald Reagan? I mean, he called the Soviet Union the empire of the evil empire, and drew these moral distinctions as well. And it's true, he did. He believed, like most people, that there was good and evil in the world. But one of the things that Ronald Reagan did, and if you go back and read his speeches, you will see this, is in every single speech, he went out of his way to emphasize how urgently he believed it was necessary to avoid military conflict with the Soviet Union, how urgently he wanted to avoid war, how really desperate he was to find a way to achieve a negotiated peace with the Soviet Union, the same country that he had identified as the evil empire. And in fact, he met with Gorbachev many, many times and negotiated many, many agreements with him. And one of the things that's so interesting is, if you look at the people now who defend these Bush policies, who claim that, well, there's this whole litany of people who are so evil that we can't possibly negotiate with them. We just need to wage a series of wars, one after the next, against them. And their favorite insult is that if you think there's a way to avoid war, it means that you're Neville Chamberlain. You are the appeaser. You are the ones in 1938 who said, oh, let Hitler have Czechoslovakia, and there's no reason to go to war with him. Every single evil country that they want to wage war on is the equivalent of Nazi Germany. Every leader that doesn't submit to America's will is the new Adolf Hitler. And every person who raises questions about or opposes whatever new war they have on their minds is the new Neville Chamberlain, guilty of appeasement and indifferent to evil. And if you go back and look at the debates that they had in the 1980s, these people now hold up Ronald Reagan as their icon. That's who they want as a leader, a strong, aggressive leader who will defend America in the world. But that isn't what they were saying about Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. They were calling Ronald Reagan the Neville Chamberlain of our country. And Newt Gingrich was saying that the meetings that he had with Gorbachev were the most dangerous meetings the world has held since Neville Chamberlain went and met with the Chancellor of Germany. Ronald Reagan was not a moral absolutist in terms of how he ruled and made decisions. He was a pragmatist about how to deal with the Soviet Union and America's other enemies. George Bush is the opposite. His view is grounded in moral absolutism. It does not change. It cannot change, because he's convinced that he's on the road to righteousness and that he's engaged in a crusade that is moralistic first and foremost. And that, I do think, distinguishes the Bush mindset from every other president we've had, and it accounts for all of these policies.
Glenn Greenwald is author of the book A Tragic Legacy: How a Good versus Evil Mentality Destroyed the Bush Presidency. This is Cato Weekly Video. Please subscribe to other podcasts at our website, cato.org.